Mr. Chavez is running for District 4 of the U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thank you. What I'd like to do is turn it over to you and say whatever it is you'd like to tell our audience.
Okay. First of all, thank you everyone for having me here. I appreciate it. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm running for Congress for District 4. Why I'm running for Congress is growing up, I've seen a lot of action happen in the political realm and government, and basically from political leaders who have been in government their entire life, who have never been in the private sector. I think what I can bring is a different set of ideas to Congress, and that's why I'm running. My background is I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My grandparents immigrated from Mexico. My grandfather was Mexican. My grandmother was a mixture of Navajo and Mexican. So my father actually spoke fluent Navajo and Spanish, but he taught me neither language. His reasoning for it was when he was growing up, he was forced to talk to his elders in their language. And he said, I'm not going to force that upon my son. However, he admitted to me later that he regretted that in life, that I didn't become a little bit closer to growing up knowing about the Navajo culture and Mexican. My aunts and uncles actually taught me a little bit about Navajo heritage as much as I could. However, growing up, and maybe I know a lot of people have had experience with this, when you grow up, you know, back in the 70s, being Native American, it wasn't as what people would consider a lot of pride back then. Back then, if you looked white, then it was better to just go with that appearance rather than come forward with your appearance that you had Navajo blood in you. As far as how much Navajo blood, I have no idea, so I am actually researching that more to find out more about my culture and my background. Growing up, I actually worked from 2011 to 2013, I worked for the IHS system at the Northern Navajo Medical Center. In CT and X-ray, just providing some of my expertise as a contractor to help out the Navajo Nation as well there with some of my medical expertise. That is actually where I met my wife. She is not Navajo, she's actually Filipino, but that is where I met my wife and we got married. And from there we went to Boston where I went to graduate school, and then we came down here back to Georgia. This is where my wife grew up. This is where her family's at. This is where we've decided to make our home. And because of that, this is where I want to strengthen my home and make it better.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Great introduction, and appreciate your connection to Indian country, and encourage you to research your background a little bit more. Growing up in Albuquerque, you are close to the 8 northern pueblos. You're a lot of Navajo folks live down in that area, so you know that there's a lot of issues in Indian country of both local and national importance. What I'd like to do is, along with my colleagues, Donna Siemens, Principal Chief Vonnie McCormick, we'd like to ask you a couple of questions about issues that are very important to us, to Indian country, both state and locally, and curious to hear what your thoughts are about that. So I'd like to start off with talking a little bit about the Indian Child Welfare Act. The Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted in 1978 in response to a crisis affecting American Indian and Alaska Native children, families, and tribes. Studies revealed that large numbers of Native American children being separated from their parents, extended families, their communities by state by state child welfare and private adoption agencies. And in fact, research found that 25 to 35% of all Native children were being removed, and of these, 85% were placed outside of the families and communities. Even when fit and willing relatives were available to adopt them, they still were taken outside the community. So at that time, not only was ICWA was not only vitally needed, but it was crafted to address some of the most long-standing and egregious removal practices, specifically targeting Native children. Among its added protections for Native children, ICWA requires caseworkers to make several considerations when handling an ICWA case, including providing active efforts to be with the family, identifying a placement that fits under the ICWA preference provisions, notifying the child's tribe and the child's parents of the custody proceeding that might be happening, and working relative and actively to involve the child's tribe and the child's parents in the proceedings. So because these added protections address not only specific systems and abuses directed at Native children, but also their unique political status and cultural considerations. As you know, tribes are tribes because of their political status and not because of their racial status. So ICWA's been labeled the gold standard of child welfare policy by experts in and national leading child advocacy organizations far beyond Indian country. It does serve as a great model. So what I'd like to ask you is right now, there's a case pending before the Supreme Court that will challenge the Indian Child Welfare Act. Should the unthinkable happen, and ICWA is found to be invalid, it would have far-reaching consequences that will be felt for generations, namely weakening protections for Native children, thus clearing the way for bad actors to grow their control over Native land, Native industry, and Native futures. So if you get elected and are sitting in Congress, would you consider, if that happens, if ICWA is overturned by the court, would you consider introducing or co-sponsoring legislation to correct what would be a real grave error by the court?
Absolutely. Because where I grew up, I was close with a lot of the Navajo Nation out there. And I know there's a lot of proud heritage there where they like to keep their heritage close. They want to keep their family members close. So stuff that doesn't happen to me, where I grew up not knowing about my Navajo background, where actually if these children are taken outside of their homes, then they're being removed from that culture and they're not being raised in the inherent culture that that their ancestors grew up with. This is something I also saw in New Mexico as well, something that really affected a lot of the tribes out there and had a detrimental impact. And I think by making sure that these kids, these families can stay close together, to make sure that they can grow up on the land that's proud to them, that the families that they know, because these are the families that know how to nurture them, they know how to raise them, and they know how to raise them with the culture that they were endowed with.
Thank you for that answer. I know I appreciate that, as well as my panelists and our audience as well. I'm going to turn the questioning over to my two fellow panelists. Donna, would you like to take the next question, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming. I want to thank you for sharing your story. I, as well, grew up with most of my childhood. I was in Albuquerque, so I know exactly what you're talking about when, what it's better to identify as, because they were not nice. But my question is, we're going to discuss the Violence Against Women Act. It creates and supports comprehensive, cost-effective responses to domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. Since its enactment in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act programs administered by the U.S. Department of Justice and Health and Human Services have dramatically improved federal, tribal, state, and local responses to these crimes. The Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2022 was included in the fiscal year 2022 omnibus spending package signed by President Joseph Biden on March 15, 2022. This bipartisan VAWA reauthorization includes groundbreaking provisions to strengthen and modernize the law. The law provides survivors the thousands of local programs that serve them in communities with much needed resources for housing, legal assistance, alternatives to criminal responses, and prevention programming. It also includes new economic justice provisions and bolsters against access for survivors of all genders in strengthening non-discrimination laws and creating LGBTQ perpetrators accountable. It also improves existing housing protections and increases access to emergency and short-term housing, and creates dedicated investments in culturally specific service providers to ensure survivors are color supported. The economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemics have greatly impacted survivors and only exacerbated the existing inequalities of our society. Additional funding and resources are needed. As Congress considers funding levels in this fiscal year 2023 appropriations legislation, do you believe that these life-saving services should be prioritized and federally funded, used to address and prevent domestic violence?
This is something I very much agree with. Working at the Northern Navajo Medical Center, I saw firsthand exactly a lot of these cases of, the violence against both kids and women. I was, one of the ones to help treat some of these women, some of these kids from the domestic violence and abuse that happened. This is something that I believe should be at the forefront, of Congress to make sure that this happens, because right now what I see is we pass a lot of bills and we pass a lot of policies and we spend a lot of money on stuff that really goes nowhere. It goes circular with no end result, where issues like this can be greatly impacted by providing the resources that is needed in order to protect these women, protect these children. Also taking it a step further and providing more education for both the families, for the men, because what we have is, we have, the domestic violence that happens, we have the women and the kids who are removed, but then it just kind of ends there, like the women, the kids, they're put in shelters, they're given that assistance, but then what happens is the perpetrators are just left there to keep the cycle of abuse going without any education on their end. So what I would like to do is I would like to see it taken a step further and taken these perpetrators and given the education that is needed in order to see what they're doing, how they're impacting their community. Because sometimes when you're faced with exactly how you're impacting your community, then it hits you a little bit harder, where you see when in that moment you're just kind of tunnel vision, narrow-sighted into what is happening at the moment, but when you see the global or the community impact that's having, then some would have they would take a step back and say, wow, this is really affecting my community, my families. I need to do something to enact change within myself.
Well, it's good to have you today, and I have enjoyed your answers so far. They sound very good. Mine is on Help America Vote Act. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 was passed by the United States Congress to make sweeping reform to the nation's voting process. HAVA addresses improvements to voting systems and voting access that were identified following 2002's election. One of the provisions within the Help American Vote Act allows for us to have funding to use to improve the voter engagement. In the state of South Dakota, the Help American Act was used to help counties pay for early in-person satellite offices and can be used for drop box elections. If you are elected, would you support funding the Help American Act?
Yes, I would, and I would, again, there is something actually I was exposed to. I met with two individuals just last night, as a matter of fact, that they have a company called Redo Voting. I don't know if you've heard of this. So basically, it's a system where people can actually vote from their phones or from any electronic device. So I know that there are certain communities, especially in New Mexico, I saw it too, where not everybody has access to Wi-Fi or anything like that. But actually, with this, what it is basically a card you can get from any basically gas station or shopping center, and then by registering both your ID to that card, you can actually vote. With people with limited access to Wi-Fi, they could actually use wherever they go grocery shopping or maybe go to the gas station, if they could set up an area where they could actually both get the card and vote at the same time. That way they can kill two birds with one stone. For those with access with a smartphone or anything, what they could do is they can register at the grocery store or at the gas station, go home, and then they can vote whenever they want to. So it actually increases the ability for people to vote. And it makes it more equitable and access for everybody. That way they can do it on their own time. And, a lot of people have to work or anything like that. And so some people don't really have the time to always go vote. Some people work sometimes 7 days a week. They have 2 or 3 jobs. So it's not like because everybody says, oh, you can go before or after work or on weekends. Well, some people work weekends, they work nights, and they work long hours. But if they had that lunch break where they could just go use their phone and vote during that time, I think this is something that needs to be explored further. Right now it's in the beta testing, so this is something that I think with more funding that we could actually push this out, especially with Native Americans, where they could get more access to vote whenever they needed to.
Well, thank you for that answer. I think that would be a really good idea.
Mr. Chavez, thank you again for coming. Truly appreciate it. Truly appreciate your answers and responses and your connectivity. I think you've got a firsthand understanding of Indian country, at least in the New Mexico area, and that's deeply appreciated. On behalf of the Native American Rights Fund, the Four Directions, NCAI, National Congress of American Indians, and Native Forward Scholarships, we want to thank you again for being part of this forum. Thank you for addressing some very, very important questions that I know our audience is very, very interested in your responses, and thank you for help educating us on what you're doing and our viewers. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.